Okay, so we'll just get started with today's presentation. So today we have Coryn Kempster and Julia Jamrozik, who are Canadian designers, artists, and educators who have collaborated since 2003. Together, they endeavor to create spaces, objects, and situations that interrupt the ordinary in critical, engaging, and playful ways. Their multidisciplinary practice, CK+JJ, operates at a variety of scales, from temporary installations to permanent public artwork and architectural projects. Their academic research focuses on the role of play in the built environment and alternative methods of documentation as a form of historic preservation. Their book, Growing Up Modern, which I have over here, Childhoods in Iconic Homes, documents the stories of the original children inhabitants of modernist houses and housing. This was published by Berkhauser in 2021, so this year. In 2018, they won the Architectural League Award in New York. And actually, we were able to have them also in 2019 for the Seoul Biennale. So we're very excited that this time you're able to present for Hanyang in 2021, as your schedule was quite tight in 2019 when you were in Seoul. So today we're gonna hear about their lecture, which they have titled Social Infrastructures, and hopefully hear a little bit more about their new publication. Well, actually it gets disrupted by the
Your background.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, they'll show an image. So we'll hear about what they're working on. There you go. Hear a little bit about what they're working on, their research, the publications, and more about these social infrastructures, which I find fascinating. Actually, one of their installations has become a permanent. It's no longer an installation. It's now a utilitarian object, architectural object, I would say. You can see it in Seoul. I don't know the name of the school, but it has become a permanent object for a playground in one of the local schools in Seoul. Perhaps we should do a field trip there one of these days, if they let us into an elementary school.
Well, send us photos if you do. We'd love to see it.
Yeah, I actually have a friend whose daughter used to go to that school. So we'll try to get photos of the piece in use.
Oh, that would be great.
Yeah.
I would love that.
Okay, so without further ado, CK and JJ, Coryn and Julie.
Great. Let us share our screen. And maybe just first of all, thank you for having us. Raphael, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for spending your morning with us. Let's see.
Did that work? Do you see our...
Yep, all good.
So now there's always a problem. Do you see me changing slides?
Are you changing right now?
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Super.
And I guess another point in terms of logistics of the presentation, if you want to indicate if you want to be interrupted with questions, or if you want to just leave it towards the end, it would be good to note.
Maybe it's better if we leave it towards the end, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
Yeah. But then we'll be happy to stick around and answer questions.
Sure. Okay.
Great.
The floor is yours.
Well, I'm Julia. This is Coryn. We're based in Buffalo, New York, where we teach at the university here. And like Raphael said, we've been working together for quite a while now. Our projects are different in scale, and they're different in their kind of preoccupations. But over the years, we've come up with these three categories that we've used to kind of give some structure in terms of the thinking of how we think about the different projects, regardless of media and scale. So the three categories that we use are domestic narratives, expanded preservation, and social infrastructures. And today we're going to touch on the first two, and then we'll focus mostly on the last one, the social infrastructures. But all three categories have, there's some overarching threads that link them together. So it's not like they're, set in stone and not related one to the other, but it is still, I think, useful for us to think of our work in terms of these categories, both in terms of past works that we've done and then in terms of future works as we take on new projects. Interrupt me, please.
Yeah, of course. You're doing so well.
So our first category is called domestic narratives. And in this group of projects, what we like to do is we like to think about use and occupation, especially of domestic spaces. And we think about how use changes over time, how people use spaces maybe differently, how we can imagine scenarios for different uses. And we use these narratives as a way of moving our designs forward. So the one project that we wanted to share in this category is called Sky House. And this was built in 2017 in Canada. It's a holiday home for a family of 3. And I think there's many ways that we could present this project. We could talk about sustainable features, we can talk about daylighting and ventilation, we can talk about materials, but really the way that, in terms of this kind of category of domestic narratives, I think the way we want to talk about it is in terms of thinking about the different spaces in the house and the different elements in the house from the perspective not of the parents who were the clients, but also from the perspective of the daughter, who in our view was also a client for the house. And so when we were doing the design, we tried to embed various moments in the house that we thought she might enjoy and remember over the time that she was using the house as a summer residence.
Although maybe it's interesting, we found out that with the pandemic, it became very much a full-time year-round house. So the clients basically went up there, I think, last March, and then they haven't come back. So it's it's getting more use than intended, but they seem pretty happy.
So maybe some of these elements that we tried to build into the house. One is in the first slide, you can see this ramp that leads up to the house, and that element was there to try to think about the entry as a kind of an experience. And there we wanted to kind of mirror the experience that one might have on a dock, so over the lake, but here, as an entry point to the house.
So it's a very distinctive sound, your feet on kind of hollow wood boards with nothing below them. And so we wanted to have that experience for the daughter when she arrives and runs up the ramp to the front door. That sound already sort of transports her psychologically into kind of the space of the holiday home versus the city. It's a family that lives in downtown Toronto, so they have quite a big contrast between their typical daily life and then their summer residence.
So some other elements, the second photo shows a set of coat hooks that we designed. We wanted those to be at different heights so that as she grows, she can reach different levels. And it also works to accommodate not only the kind of small family of 3, but also when the cottage is visited by large family and friend groups, for everyone to have a place to hang their coats. On the third photo, we're showing the fireplace socle where Coryn's sitting, but actually we imagined it as a place where she might spend time with her dog. And then the last picture shows her on the swing that is suspended underneath the house as a kind of spot to maybe escape from her parents and enjoy a moment all to herself, especially as she's becoming a teenager. So our second category of works, and of course there's other projects, but for the sake of time, we're focusing on one each in these first 2 categories. So in extended preservation, we're going to be talking about Growing Up Modern, which is the research project that has resulted in the book that Raphael just showed. And actually the themes in the house and the themes in the book are not unrelated. Growing Up Modern documents the stories of children who were, I'm gonna mute this person, is that okay?
Yeah, already muted.
Perfect.
Okay, so
Sorry.
for participants, please, I'm gonna ask to keep your microphones off.
Yeah, so the book documents the stories of people who were, as children, the first to live in iconic modernist buildings. So buildings built in the 20s, 30s, and 50s. And what we wanted to do is to try to understand these buildings from the point of view, not just of architectural historians and the architects, but to understand these buildings from the point of view of people who use them, from their users, and especially from the point of view of the people who were the first to live there as children.
I think it was interesting for us to focus on the very first children that lived in these buildings for two reasons. One, of course, they're very old people now, and so there was some sense of urgency that this was a kind of a last chance to collect these stories. But I think more important was the idea that when these buildings were built, they were at their most radical. And so the impact of growing up there would be the greatest, or would have the potential to be more extraordinary. So somebody growing up in the Unité d'Habitation, when it first opened, is quite a different thing when it was a UFO that crash landed out of nowhere and shocked, if not all of Marseille, but even all of France. Than somebody growing up there now, when it's already been like very well adopted and loved. It's historically protected. It's prices to buy an apartment there now are extremely expensive because it's a very desired place to be. So we were curious to hear like the first experiences when these buildings were really the very radical propositions that they are.
And so in the book, we make the case for personal narrative as a way of writing architectural history. We used oral history methods. Now, we're not oral historians, but we did use interviews as the kind of primary source for our writing. And in the book, we try to make the case that that method is as important as a form of storytelling about these buildings as much more conventional architectural history writing or theory writing. And one reason for that is, and this is a quote from Naomi Stead and Janina Gassai, is that as they say, oral history interviews are able to puncture through architecture's professional mask and kind of uncover much more humane, much more polyphonic, much more social narratives. And the other thing we make the case for in the book is that these stories need to be preserved, and that they need to be preserved maybe as much or maybe even more so than the buildings themselves, because through these stories, one gets a sense of not just the building, but also the kind of the time when it was built. And so it's a kind of a deeper sense of memory that one can gain from the stories than just what the kind of bricks and mortar of the buildings themselves hold. So for each of there's 4 stories in the book, and for each of the stories, there's a chapter, and each of the chapters we've divided into these 3 sections. So for each of the buildings, there's an objective history, and we're quite consciously, using the term objective in quotation marks here because there's not really such a thing as an objective history, but it's a very short summary about the building itself and kind of the basic facts about it. The second part of each chapter is the subjective history, again, in quotation marks. And this is really the part that is a kind of a narrative based on the conversation that we had with the person who lived in the building. So for example, and then, accompanied by historical photos and other documentation, such as a set of annotated plans for each of the buildings, which the coral dots show or amplify the space spaces that were important in the stories that we heard. And then lastly, for each of the buildings, there is a photo essay. And so what we did is we had the conversations with the people who grew up there, and then we were able to visit the houses or the apartments ourselves, and we took photographs and we documented the spaces that typically might not get documented in architectural photography from based on the stories that we heard. So trying to kind of illustrate and emphasize the spaces in these iconic homes that were maybe more significant to the children rather than to a more common or more traditional architectural photographer.
And I think something I want to just point out is it was important for us to speak to the children. I mean, on the one hand, because of course the parents of all of these children are long since passed, so there's no possibility to speak to the parents. But there is already a historical record, at least in some of the instances. For example, the Tugendhat house, there is writing from the parents about their experience in the house. But we thought it'd be very interesting to talk to the children, because in some sense they were the guinea pigs, right? So kids get dragged along into whatever situation the parents choose to throw them into, and then they just have to deal with it. Whereas if you could imagine as a parent, as somebody with an agency, and you're either hiring a famous architect or you're choosing to rent an apartment in a building designed by a famous architect, you're probably already primed yourself to enjoy the experience in a way, but that we kind of suppose maybe the kids would have a more raw opinion or a more somehow more unvarnished truth to tell about the place, because they wouldn't have had any reason to like or dislike, or they could just deal with the thing for what it was, as opposed to the parents who would of course bring a lot of kind of cultural baggage and personal baggage into the situation already.
Yeah, so maybe we'll just share a few of the stories that we heard. So the first person we spoke with was Mr. Rolf Fassbender, and he grew up in one of the JJP Aud row houses at the Weissenhofsiedlung in Stuttgart. And Mr. Fassbender had lots of stories to share with us, but one of the stories that sticks out the most in our minds is the story about the balcony, which was, you can see the balcony here, off of his bedroom. So his bedroom was the smallest in the house, and yet it was the one with the balcony. And what Mr. Fassbender would do is he would open the doors, and he would, in the summer, drag his mattress outside so that he could sleep under the stars on the balcony. And one more story from Mr. Fassbender is this very tiny moment in the Weissenhofsiedlung, just around the corner from where the row houses were. This was the spot where the kids would count when they were playing hide and seek. So for Mr. Fassbender, the neighborhood and the kind of larger spaces of the Weissenhofsiedlung were, I think, as important as the spaces of the home itself. And this particular moment was exemplary of those for us.
We spoke to Ernst Tugendhat, who grew up in the Tugendhat house by Mies van der Rohe. And so there's a picture of Ernst as a child reaching for the main door. And we, of course, went back to the house and photographed it sort of from his point of view. I think let's skip a slide, no. One of the things that was interesting, I think, in speaking with Mr. Tugendhat is he was very conscious when he was telling us stories when he could genuinely remember something from his childhood, or when he suspected he was remembering something because he's had the aid of a photograph of that thing in a family photo album all of those years, or when he wasn't sure whether he was genuinely remembering something or it's something he thought later and he's kind of casting that memory onto his childhood self. But one of the things he shared with us is that so his family was forced to flee the Czech Republic with the advance of the Nazis. But he had the feeling that he would have not stayed in the house if they had been allowed to remain. he was very self-conscious about it. And again, he couldn't remember if that was at the time or in retrospect. But he felt like it was a very bold gesture of a home for the city where it was, and I think he was very self-conscious about that.
Especially in retrospect, I think, because he was only 8 when the family was forced to flee. So that's maybe another thing about the stories, is that depending on how long the people lived in the houses, their kind of intensity of their stories changes dramatically. And so, for example, Mrs. Helga Zumpfe, who grew up in the Schminke house by Hans Scharoun, she spent most of her childhood there. She was 18 when she left. So she's got incredibly strong and incredibly fond memories of the house. One of the details she talked about was these colored glass portholes in the doors that led from the house out into the garden. And so this, you can, if you can imagine, this is at a child's eye level. What Scharoun had done is he placed these colored glass portholes in each of the doors, and each one had a different color. And so Mrs. Zumpfe would as a little girl, she would run from door to doors and be able to kind of look at the world through different color, through the different color glass. So see the world through different colors. And she loved the house so much, she still dreams about it, which is kind of amazing.
The last person that we included in the book was Gisele Moreau, who grew up in the Unité de Habitation by Corbusier in Marseille. And so her and her family were the first to occupy their particular apartment. And then she, as a young adult, went away for university. But when she started her own family, she actually moved back to the building and occupied a variety of different apartments over the years, and then eventually inherited her parents' apartment where she grew up. And so she's still living there today. So we were actually able to interview her in her childhood home, which was very interesting. And her favorite part of the house, she had a lot of stories to tell, but her favorite part of the building, excuse me, is the rooftop, and specifically the pool. And she can remember very clearly that if you can see the sort of concrete rock over here, she remembers sunbathing against that rock when the story came over the radio that Corbusier had died. And she sort of had this moment of feeling, she feels so close with the building and sort of by extension with Corbusier, that when she would hear news like that or something to do with Corbusier, she almost had the feeling like somebody was speaking about her, in the sense of just how kind of intertwined her life has become in the story of this building, which is pretty remarkable.
And so I guess maybe just to say, finish up on the Growing Up Modern project, is just that one of the aims of the book was to really try to understand these buildings that we as students learned about in university and architecture history classes, and wanting to understand these buildings and portray these buildings in a more kind of intimate way, and to make the point that architecture isn't, architecture only gets better when it's used. And the stories of the people who occupy and live there, the stories of the people who make it, the stories of the people who build it, there's lots of stories that come into play into the making of architecture, not just the stories of the architect. And I think that's the kind of bigger aim of the book.
So the third category of work, and what we mostly want to talk to you today about, is what we call social infrastructures. And so these are a series of projects that we've been doing for the past 5 years. And it's evolved now into something where I think we have a bit of a toolkit for understanding what we mean by a social infrastructure, but then also like being able to design a social infrastructure as new opportunities come in. So that maybe the most important thing for us is that the social infrastructure has to happen in public space. And then what we want to do is try to foster interaction in that public space. Essentially just get people interacting with one another. Whether that's people who've come together to the space, or in kind of the best possible scenario, people who've arrived separately and don't know each other and might prompt some kind of interaction that they otherwise wouldn't have had. It's kind of the main thing that we're after. And I think that's a direct response to the times that we're living in. I think everyone can feel that, you know, public space, there's been a lot written about the erosion of public space, largely through private real estate ventures and public-private partnerships, surveillance. So there's already kind of, I think, an idea out there that public space is getting called into question or being eroded. But I think also then from within, even when we're in public space, thanks to our mobile phones, we're very often not interacting with the people around us. So we might be present in public space, but not aware of what's happening around us and not necessarily interacting with the people around us. And so we're trying to create opportunities for these kind of physical engagements in real time, in real space. And so as I said, we've started to develop a toolkit for how to approach these. And one of the first things that we picked up on was to co-opt the language of play. It started with just an observation here in Buffalo that's probably true everywhere in the world, I would imagine, that playgrounds are really moments in a city where people from every social, economic, racial background can kind of come together and share something in common. And also we sort of observed that the act of play is also like a good disarming mechanism. It's a way of getting people's guard down, letting them open up to other experiences, just as opposed to the kind of serious business of going about.
And maybe just to add there
city.
that like that happens obviously for the kids who are playing on a playground, but also significantly, I think it happens for other age groups as well. So it happens for teenagers, it happens for the adults and seniors as well, right? So it's not just when we say play, we don't just mean little kid play, although that's important too, but play maybe for all generations and also intergenerationally.
We've also in a lot of our projects taken to using what we call a familiar prompt. So that's just an object from everyday life that anyone would recognize and know how to use. And so, for example, a swing, it doesn't need an instruction manual, right? You see a swing, you know what to do. So that for us would be a familiar prompt. Now we might try to do something to that familiar prompt, like here we've ganged the swings together so it doesn't behave like a normal swing, but you don't need to be told how to use it. And that helps in a lot of our projects. And sometimes it's as simple as just color. We're usually trying to use color in a way to be as, to stand out as much from its background as possible. To just be bright and high visibility as a kind of welcoming gesture to draw attention to the project or the infrastructure and to like invite people to use it. We'll touch on it briefly. There's a few times when we've used color in political ways as well, but we can come to more of that later. And as I said, we've been doing this for about 5 years now, and we've been really fortunate to have a lot of opportunities to do social infrastructures, some very temporary and some permanent.
So in some way it started with this series of gardens that we designed. This was actually for a garden festival that happens yearly in Quebec. And what we did there is use this very cheap material, which is barricade tape or barrier tape, something that one might use to kind of just temporarily delineate a perimeter, like a don't cross line. And instead, what we've done is we've used that material as a way of kind of welcoming people into a space. And because of the kind of lightness of the material, it really reacts to weather, it reacts to wind, both in terms of movement, but also in terms of sound. There's a lot of rustling that happens, and it also reacts to sunlight because it's translucent. So there's a lot of, it creates very different kind of light and shadow conditions and very different movement depending on the weather. And what we really wanted to do with this garden is to try to make it a space not just where you could observe these differences, but also where you could kind of spend time and both interact with the installation, but maybe also interact with others who were there.
So the chairs are a custom sort of bespoke chair that we designed specifically in a way that people could kind of only recline, with the kind of overt suggestion that they spend time, that it's a place to hang out. And then we were invited, we did different iterations of that garden for I think eight years in the end. After about 5 years, the Museum of Civilization in Quebec City approached the garden festival and asked if they could have some version of our installation on their rooftop. This is a Moshe Safdie designed building, which has a very interesting rooftop that is open to the public. You can actually walk upstairs on the outside without a ticket and get to the roof and continue even and walk down the other side and get to the street on the other side of the building. But they were just experiencing that it wasn't clear to people that they could go up there. And then once they got up there, the conditions were a bit harsh. It's windy, it's very sunny. And so they approached us through the garden to design something that would provide shade, but also like a clear sign from the sidewalk that there was a destination, a reason to kind of go up the stairs. And so we came up with Roofline Garden, which was a play on the roof of the museum, which has all these pitched roofs, but then also the old town of Quebec City, which is got a lot of pitched roofs. And so it's very similar to the previous project we showed, just a bit larger in scale and different in detail.
And we've done this project for 3 years, and every year we did a different kind of color combination for the ribbons. So this was the second year, and then in the third year, that was last year, right?
And then we were commissioned to do a project in El Paso, but just for like a long weekend, just for, I think it was a 3 or 4 day arts festival. And so it was, when we were invited to El Paso, of course, it's impossible to ignore the border. So for people who don't know, El Paso is a city in America, right on the border with Mexico, but then directly on the other side of the border is Juarez, a very large Mexican city, and together they're essentially one metropolis. And that situation is getting more and more difficult, but when you speak to people there, the city, at least historically, has really functioned as a transnational space. People freely crossing the border, living in Juarez, but going to school in El Paso or
I don't know if they're crossing the border freely, but crossing it often.
No, but sorry, I don't mean free. I mean, there's of course controls, but like crossing it very often. It would be no big deal for people in El Paso to go have dinner in Juarez and then come back at the end of the evening. So, and of course, we were invited in, I don't remember exactly, 2018, I think, kind of the height of Trump's mania about the wall, and this was very much on everyone's mind. And we were offered this site within 500 meters of this wall of the border. And so we knew we had to deal with it in some way. And so we wanted to use the tape because that seemed to be a good response to such a temporary event. And we wanted to deal with this border condition. We had this realization that like, even the two flags of the two countries have more in common than what separates them, just like the people. So the American flag is red, white, and blue, and the Mexican flag is red, white, and green. So we tried to make red, white, and blue, green. And so we had those 4 colors of barricade tape, then overprinted with stripes in every conceivable combination of those 4 colors to try and blend the things together. We used these Mylar reflective balloons, which look like a very sort of playful child's version of actually a much more sinister surveillance balloon that gets used on that border at this location. And then bricks to tie them to the ground, to tether them, literally kind of, what you might construct a wall from. And it was very interesting throughout the festival. It was very playful. We were trying to take all these like wall elements, but make a space that could bring people together and give them something fun and playful to do. And they absolutely did that. even even to the destruction of the installation in many instances. But it was also amazing to me. We didn't put a text anywhere explaining how we arrived at this, but I had a lot of people come up to me and tell it back to me, that where the colors were coming from, what the balloons were referencing. People really got it, because I think it's very much their lived experience in this location, which was interesting and was very unexpected. And then at the very end, we just gave it away. We just, all of the volunteers that were watching the site just took a pair of scissors and started handing out balloons. And then the thing was able to just disappear into the city like nothing happened at the end of the event. And I'd like to think that a number of the balloons also walked across the border and found their way into Juarez.
So sometimes the projects are very temporary. Sometimes they're a little less temporary. This was actually a project that was built for a summer, and it was built in Cleveland, Ohio, in the reading garden of their main public library. So the space that you're seeing here, the exterior space, is kind of sandwiched between two buildings that belong to the library. And they have this kind of yearly installation that through which they try to activate this reading courtyard. And so the project that we did for this commission was called Dialogue. And maybe just like the project in El Paso, we were a little bit cheeky about our use of color for it.
Yeah, so we were invited to do this in January of 2016, 17, whenever Donald Trump took office. So this was like very much in America and in around much of the world on everyone's mind. And at that moment in America, there were two hats. You either had a Make America Great Again hat, which was red, or you had a resistance pink pussy hat, which was pink. And so we made the installation pink fading into red as a way of trying to welcome everybody to use it and respond to this moment, this very divisive moment in America, where it literally felt like you couldn't even look people in the eye on the sidewalk, much less talk to them. We certainly felt that very much here in Buffalo. And speaking to other people, it was a very common experience. There was, I think, regardless of what side you were on, and it was kind of divisive in that way, it really was this moment where people just couldn't talk to each other. And the whole idea for this installation was like, well, what if we just did something playful to try and get people to talk to each other? Just anything, didn't matter, what, but like something. And so we took the sound cones that you might have seen on a playground, and then made this sculpture where every sound cone is paired with another, but because of the way that the sculpture is, it's not clear which one is connected to which other one. So it's a bit of a game, like you yell into one, but you don't know where your voice is going to come out on the other end.
And we thought that might be a way of trying to get people to, it would be a game to try to figure out what's connected to what, but we were kind of curious if it would result in conversations or even just a physical acknowledgement of people with whom you might not ordinarily talk. And we were curious about, if that would work. To what extent can we kind of prompt people to have conversations or to speak to one another, to acknowledge one another.
I think that the next project we'll show you is something we call Full Circle. This was a project we did with SEPA Gallery here in Buffalo and CS1 curatorial projects. It was part of a series of installations that took place on empty lots. Buffalo, like cities that you might be more familiar with, maybe like Detroit, has a complete surplus of empty lots because of the kind of huge economic downturn that Buffalo and other Rust Belt cities like Detroit have experienced in the last 50 years, 60 years. So basically the whole neighborhoods and then houses as they either burn down or fall apart don't get replaced, and they just get demolished, and then you get all of these empty spaces in the city.
So what SEPA Gallery did is they organized for a series of public artworks to be installed in these empty lots in a particular neighborhood in Buffalo called the West Side.
And this really just started with a simple premise. We were thinking on a playground how when you're normally swinging, you swing beside the other people swinging and you don't actually interact with them. And so what would happen if you organized the swing set in a circle so that you were swinging towards the people that you were swinging with, if you would then have a kind of an interaction, or if it would make a difference.
And of course you have the choice, you can face in or you can face out. Nobody's forcing you to face in, but we were kind of curious about the possible connections that that simple twist from a line to a circle could create.
And of course, the other big difference in the experience is there's a much more palpable element of danger, because if you're swinging towards other people, of course we designed it so that you can't collide, but in the moment that you're doing it, you're not so confident. So there's a kind of heightened sense of danger in a way that is, I think, for a lot of people, very enjoyable.
I think the other thing about making it a circle is that it creates a space, just through that kind of simple defining of a circular space. And then I think through the color, again, we were able to kind of give it an identity. And so even though it's this, it was a very, very low budget project, done with a lot of volunteer help and a lot of favors, it's become a little bit of a meeting space in this neighborhood because there's not much infrastructure, there's not many green spaces, there's not many public spaces, there's not many benches where you can sit. But also because I think it's kind of identifiable and people call it the pink swings, and it's, at the scale of the neighborhood, it's become a meeting place. And I think, again, with this project, what was important to us was that also through maybe defamiliarizing it a little bit, so not just installing a linear swing, but installing a circular swing, we were hoping that it would be a space not just for kids, but that it might start to appeal to other age groups, adults, teenagers, and basically, and it has, I think, through, the project was supposed to be up for 1 year. It's now been up for 5. And it kind of continues to be supported by the gallery. They continue to pay for the insurance. They continue to pay for upgrades, maintenance, painting,
Repairs.
repairs and stolen swings. And so I think that's on some level is proof that it gets a lot of love from the neighborhood as well, and it has some significance there.
Yeah, and you can track that a little bit through social media as well. It gets independent of us. We can see other people interacting on Facebook and Instagram with the swings and saying what they think about it and how they feel about it. Maybe another dimension of this project, which we didn't at all intend, but for which we're extremely happy, is we ended up with another project speaking to an organization that helps resettle refugees in Buffalo. And Buffalo, in the context of America, actually resettles more refugees per capita, or at least historically, has resettled more refugees per capita than any other city.
And hopefully they'll do it again.
And hopefully they'll go back to doing it than any other city in America. And a lot of the refugees get resettled on the west side in the neighborhood where this swing is. There's an especially large, I think the largest concentration of Burmese refugees in America are here on Buffalo's west side. And anyway, this organization that we spoke to said of the swing set that it was opportunities like that are also really important to them because it gives the new immigrants something completely normal that they can do in public space and be seen by longer term residents of the neighborhood doing something completely normal in a way that totally humanizes them and makes it clear that, like, yeah, of course, they're just people with kids and families and jobs and stress and lives like everybody else. And those kind of opportunities are really important in trying to integrate people into a new home. And so that was a really nice kind of side of the project that we didn't intend, but is of course very welcome.
And a lot of us, the work with the social infrastructures and our thinking about Full Circle in particular has been influenced by the work of Aldo Nike. And actually, when we were invited to come and do an installation in Seoul, it was about, we were thinking again about Aldo Nike. And so Aldo Nike was a Dutch architect who was working in Amsterdam after World War II. And what he was doing was he was responding to the situation of lots of buildings that had been torn down in the war, bombed in the war, but he was also responding to the fact that there was very little infrastructure for children in particular. And so what he did is he worked through the city of Amsterdam to both appropriate some of these empty lots or empty building sites, but also spaces within the city to provide a kind of social infrastructure for the children and more broadly for the citizens of Amsterdam. And his approach, and I think what's interesting to us is his approach was also one that was very much focused on an idea of a network. So a lot of small scale interventions as opposed to maybe one giant intervention.
And so one of what he did to design, because he designed how many, 600? 700 playgrounds. He basically designed a kit of parts, like a series of play structures, and then he would sort of deploy them in different configurations, which is how he was able to, in such a short time, develop so many playgrounds. And one of the most iconic is this climbing frame, which now is kind of on virtually every playground, potentially even in the world. And so when Raphael invited us to do something in Seoul, and we wanted to deal with Aldo Nike, we thought what better way than to kind of copy or replicate or like quote one of these climbing frames from Aldo Nike. And of course, we then took that, like we do with other things, like as a kind of ready-made or a given, and then we wanted to do something to make it unusual or different than the way that you would normally experience one of his climbing frames. So we asked Raphael to have 3 of the frames fabricated and then joined together in this unusual configuration. And so the result here was an installation for the Biennale, which we called Aldo, of course, in reference to Van Eyck. And then again, kind of like this swing set, we were trying to create a space by connecting these elements one to the other. And it was very heartening when we learned that the kids needed no explanation of what to do with this. As soon as the kind of caution tape around it was taken down, we were told that they figured it out right away.
And this is the project that you can, I think, visit at one of the local elementary schools, and Raphael can tell you which one.
Yeah. And that was very nice because from the beginning when we were talking to Raphael and his team, our idea was that, if we were going to have this thing fabricated out of steel and it would be quite durable, it would be a pity to do all of that for like a short event, and it would be nice if it could be reused or have an afterlife. And we talked about various possibilities, shipping it to Buffalo and putting it up somewhere here, or maybe resiting it somewhere closer to home in Seoul. And then before we could really resolve anything, somebody approached the Biennale from this school asking if they could have it. And so that was, of course, completely perfect for everybody. And so that the idea of reuse took care of itself, which was wonderful.
We should probably.
Yeah, I think we're getting close to the end, or maybe we'll start speeding up a little bit.
We do have a few more projects, but.
This is Breakwater. We've been doing a series of projects now. We've built 3, and we're working on 3 more this summer for a national nonprofit in America called Kaboom that tries to bring play to children in unexpected places, and with a specific focus on underserved and financially disadvantaged communities. And so Breakwater, this is in Jamestown, New York. And what we did is we found these huge dolos, and I'm sure you guys will recognize these because we first saw them in Korea when we were in Busan. Was the first time we were ever aware of dolos. And our first reaction was just like, wow, I want to climb on those. That looks awesome. And so that was a long time ago for a different Biennale, and it took us a long time with that in the back of our head to get a chance to do it, but we had our chance a couple of years ago. We managed to find a few dolos that had been cast extra for a big US Army Corps of Engineering project on Lake Erie. These were still sitting in the precast concrete factory's yard. And so we were able to purchase them very, very cheaply because they were leftovers and bring them to Jamestown. And basically all we did was set them in a puddle of playground rubber. So it's like soft and squishy, hopefully makes it clear that you're meant to climb them and it's okay if you fall off. And then we coated them with a plastic, very colorful plastic coating to make them just a tiny bit soft and more approachable. And another project that we did for the same organization, we designed a module, two modules, a C-shaped module and an S-shaped module. And we had these custom fabricated again out of that soft playground rubber. And then we did, this project is located at a school in Lindenville, New York. And so we actually held a workshop, a sort of day-long workshop, and they brought in like one after the other, all of their different classes of kids. And we had scale models of these two modules, and the kids could just play with them. And we just watched what the kids did, and we documented that. And then we used that very seriously, like kind of tried to learn from what the kids had done with the blocks to kind of make a configuration then that we could afford for the budget, and then have these blocks fabricated and then really make it in front of the school. And what was pretty cool is as this was getting installed, this is the cafeteria. The kids couldn't believe that we actually came back to build the thing because we told them we would in the workshop. But of course, you know, like almost a year passed between those two things, and they thought for sure we'd given up.
So when they're this scale, they're obviously not, they're glued down. They're not going to be movable anymore. But there was still a kind of a one-to-one relationship between the workshop and the final thing.
And then so that was the finished piece. And then this is now the company that we worked with to fabricate them is now has now turned it into a product. So this can now be purchased as curvy blocks in North America and as Euroflex in Europe and hopefully Korea as a product. That
hoping you're getting royalties for that as well.
We got a small royalty for each one. And then basically the premise behind the whole system was like, if bricks are orthogonal and they make you want to build kind of orthogonal walls, if the brick was curved, it kind of forces you to make a playful wall. So it doesn't really matter what people build with these, they're always going to result in something kind of playful and lighthearted. And also self-structural, interestingly. One of the very last projects, maybe we'll go through this very quickly, is a public art sculpture in Lethbridge, Alberta. It's in front of a new multicultural center, and it was like the 1% of the budget for the new building for art. And they wanted something to symbolize multiculturalism and community building. And what we tried to do is give them actual chairs that they could use to actually build community. And we did a similar thing on a much lower budget in Cleveland, where we just took off the shelf regular chairs, but we bolted them to the sidewalk in fun configurations. Hopefully in ways that, you know, while you're waiting for the bus in this Caterpillar, you might talk to the person in front of you.
And the last project we'll share is actually an interior project, so not a public space at all, but a project that kind of tries to take on some of these ideas of social infrastructure and tries to say, okay, well, what if you had to do it inside? What if you, what would a social infrastructure look like? And so we were asked to design a cafe here in Buffalo. And we wanted to treat that cafe as a social infrastructure. So the main element in the cafe is a bar. And what we did for that is we used reclaimed tables that we then had grafted together and painted all the same color to create this really strong element within the cafe that would have this kind of very unique identity.
And we chose to work with the idea of a bar precisely to try and encourage more social interaction. So in most cafes in Buffalo anyway, it's like individual cafe tables, and you come with your group and you occupy a table and you kind of pretend like you're not connected to anyone else who's come to the cafe. But of course, the great potential with a bar is that it's much less clear what's your space, what's my space. We're more likely to sit next to each other, even if we didn't arrive together. And then also, of course, you have this great interaction with the staff on the other side of the bar. So it's kind of, for us, it was about making the staff area as long as possible and thin so that the staff were kind of almost forced to interact with the customers, but in a way that the cafe owner was very keen about. And then to use these tables to create this weird archipelago of peninsulas and just maximum surface area for the customers to congregate at, in the way that we hoped it would get them to rub shoulders, sit across from somebody that they weren't expecting. We even went as far as to specify stools that had like this really good ball bearing swiveling top. So it's super easy to like swing around and be like, what'd you say? Really try to get at the social side of it. The irony of all of that is the cafe opened 1 week before everything got locked down, and of course nobody's being allowed to sit at the bar. The cafe's open, but it's, you know, like everything else, it's having to reconfigure itself for public health instead of public interaction. But we trust it's temporary and that it'll get back to business as usual.
And maybe just one more thing with the cafe is we tried to use very cheap materials for most of it. We made the lights ourselves. You know, we had these reclaimed tables and pegboard used for a lot of other surfaces. So tried to do a lot with not very much and try to kind of create a cohesive and strong environment, a vibrant environment, but at the same time, not something that is always in your face and too strong. So that was the kind of trying to reach a balance there.
Yeah, I think that's us.
That's us. Those are our 3 categories.
Yeah, we'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah, let's open up for discussion. And well, first I want to mention how I really, I mean, that's why I've seeked you for the 2019 Biennale, but I've always enjoyed this idea that you just have a clear theme of play, and this clear idea can be taken at multiple scales, which you talked about how you operate at many scales and even the diverse range of projects. But there's always this condition of play that can be seen as an urban tool or as an interior tool, or even in architecture, even in the house, the idea of focusing on the girl rather than the parents, because that would give you a more softer feel, I would say, in terms of how to use the space. I think it creates a very cohesive sense of how you can understand a theme for the whole range from city to product, I would say. Mm-hmm. So it's a very playful, I mean, it's in the word, but it's actually very serious in its use. It's very rigorous in every focused way of every, in every project, I would say. And I think to relate it to something that we've been discussing actually at Hanyang is this idea of the urban void versus public space versus open space. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you related to the works of Aldo in a more contemporary way, which I think it's actually has to revamp even more now with the Corona situation and I would say post-Trump situation as well. Yeah, that you might have an urban void and you might have projects that say, well, let's build a plaza. So now it's no longer a just empty void. Now we'll make it public space. but even public space doesn't mean much unless it's activated.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of your works focus more on the use, the activation, the interaction, rather than just having open space.
Yeah. Yeah, there isn't, I mean, of course, there's some value in void, right? In just empty space, especially if everyone feels like they can use it. But I think with our work, we feel that you often need that prompt. You need that thing that will attract you there. And you need that thing to make you feel like you're allowed to be there in some ways. I think that's what we often see with kids on playgrounds, is that the playground signifies that it's a space for them, right? No matter what it is, no matter how terrible the playground is, it's some sort of a sign to the child that they're welcome. And I think at their best, I think that's what we hope the social infrastructures are. It's not that they're meant to fill the space necessarily, although sometimes they do just because the spaces are so small. But it's that they are meant to kind of encourage people to stay and encourage people to hopefully interact as well.
Yeah, I feel like your projects are meant to focus on the, well, I already said activation, but I think it's more about the efficiency of use. Oh, we have an emergency alert of Corona.
Oh.
Anyway, I was saying that it seems that your projects are more about making the urban fabric as efficient as possible. So you have all these spaces, but some of them might not be as utilized as they should be. So your projects actually activate them to its, let's say, 100% potential, rather than the government just supplying some public space, right? So I think it's about maximizing the efficiency of the urban fabric. Have you guys have you looked at it from an urban research point of view, that you like analyze or map out these like urban voids and then figure out, maybe we can activate these, or I don't know, like, is that something that you guys do, or is just inherent in the theme that you guys are focusing on play, and then the project just, you get a commission for a project, but does it ever come from your side that you already have this idea of like the city?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the context of Buffalo, we absolutely have, and gone as far as to start mapping all of the empty lots, which we see as the same as Van Eyck's potential in Amsterdam. That's the great potential here in Buffalo. And we'd love to see a network of these very small scale spaces, not all designed by us, of course, like designed by lots of people. It would be great. And we've done various grant applications that have not proceeded to try and like kickstart a serious research about that and implementation of a network specifically on starting on the west side, and then hopefully growing out into more parts of the city.
I mean, what's kind of interesting is that this nonprofit Kaboom that we've done several projects with, I think their mission is similar to in that respect to our own, and I think they have it's not necessarily an urban approach, it's a regional approach, where every year they are trying to do a distribution of grants, 20, 30 or so grants within the region, and so I think that there is a kind of a regional agenda there, because they're trying to kind of fulfill their mission, but through a series of projects.
Well, the other question I had in relation to that was the notion of branding, which perhaps you don't see it as that that's the approach, that you're looking at branding the like your projects. But there is a cohesive sense of use of color and material. And when you see the body of work, it's all very, again, a very cohesive body of work that you identify immediately, these are the same designers. Is there a sense of branding, or not really? And it's just, I mean, because again, every project was very specific. Let's say the one in El Paso, the use of the color was in relation to the flags. In Cleveland, the one of pink to red because of the colors. But somehow still they all feel very cohesive, even though you might change a little bit of the color.
It's absolutely not, hasn't been a conscious branding exercise, but we're now very conscious of it. We sincerely,
I would say with some projects more than others, but
it's funny because we sincerely, with every project, there's always the color moment, and we spend a whole day. We have some good north light in our office, just outside the office door, with all of our Pantone sets out and looking at color, and we really consider everything, and then somehow it always ends up magenta. It's just
no, but I feel like even if you use like cyan or whatever other Pantone color, it would probably still feel cohesive somehow.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're always guilty of very saturated colors. That's something that we've identified for ourselves. But I think one of the reasons that it often ends up magenta is because there's so little magenta in our built environment. So if our aim is to contrast, that's always an easy contrast, right? We've often, based the color selection on what certain products come in, like for example, this swing or other things. So there's a kind of a mixture of what's off the shelf and what's available with, some of our sensibilities maybe.
Yeah.
But
we also at the same time, like, we have it's not a problem that it I think you're right that there is a kind of, now over time with a repetition of projects, there is maybe a branding, and we're not shy about that. That's fine. Like that's and hopefully advantageous. Hopefully that is helpful in some way.
I think it's becoming almost like a kit of parts that it doesn't get repeated, but it can get identifiable. That if you were to produce many in the same city, then it becomes the actual infrastructural network. It's not pieces, a piecemeal operation, but you can read the entire framework in the city.
And that's something we did propose unsuccessfully as a grant application, but to do a series of like a dozen interventions on empty lots in Buffalo, designed by us and others, but with all of them that particular shade of magenta for that very reason. And so there would be like Chumi's lavalettes where you have these nodes that you immediately, even though they're all different, they're all belong together, and you recognize them. Exactly what you just said. And we'd love to realize that one day. I think that would be really great.
And I tend to monopolize all these questions, but because I'm always interested in the guests. But if anybody from the audience as well has some questions, please feel free to ask openly. Right now we're just having an open conversation. So any questions
I have a question. So I really like the design about the social interaction, and I also like the color. Like I feel like I want to jump in there and try it. So I have a question that we all know that we have to face the really problem right now. Like the current situation is the COVID pandemic, right? So it's the social distance has changed everything. It's and the social interaction also one of them. So I think so do you think that your designs, like on the example that you the case study that you gave, is there any change or how it has adapted to the current situation? And another question is how what way of social interaction will change based on the current situation? Do you think, like, do you have any idea that how it will be operated, how the social interaction will change in the future? Yeah, that's my question.
I think one of the interesting things with the pandemic is that it's made us, I think for us, it's made us appreciate the value of outdoor spaces. And that I think goes for people's private outdoor spaces, but I think it also goes for more public outdoor spaces, because it's safer to meet outside, right? It's that much safer than meeting indoors. And so, but also just to kind of be outside seems safer, feels safer. And so one of my hopes from the pandemic is that for housing, it'll mean that everyone gets outdoor space as part of their housing. And I think that the other hope is that we put more value into our public spaces as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's going to want to touch everything or sit very close to one another, but I still think that, you know, we are craving human contact, but we are much more aware of the kind of settings where it's more safe to do so rather than less safe to do so.
And I think one of the encouraging things in that way is it's becoming, from what I understand, more and more clear that the spread is absolutely through airborne droplets and less through touching surfaces. So I think that kind of contradiction of like, we're all at this moment especially aware of how much we need good public space at the same moment that like we don't want to be caught dead in public space. But hopefully those two things are now a year into this reconciling themselves a bit better as we understand the risks more scientifically, more clearly. But it's for sure going to mean that these spaces will be designed differently. Like it's a new lens through which everyone, ourselves included, designing public space, are forever now going to have to view their designs through like, and so what happens to this space in the next pandemic? And, you know, and like, how have we accounted for that? What's the, you know, how does it change? How is it altered? Or how is it already prepared or ready for handling that? You know.
Yeah, like the projects that you did for the orange chairs that then you bolted down on the sidewalk in many different orientations. Do those become, well, actually, I don't know the parameters there, but is it that you have to be 6 feet apart, like 2 meters apart? Yeah. Right. So do you have to place them 6 feet apart and create configurations in that sense? Or perhaps
we've done some of those proposals.
We proposed literally a huge circle of chairs in different orientations, but all exactly 6 feet from one another as a kind of like COVID memorial space. But we didn't find a taker. We tried twice. Maybe the third time will be the charm.
And maybe that's something to just say for the students, especially on the call, is just with a lot of these projects, it's, you know, you come up with the idea and then you kind of, you propose it for competition, you propose it for a call, and you often have to propose it many times before it actually happens. And so that's one of the things that we've learned over time, is just to kind of persevere with the ideas and to adapt them also based on, you know, sites, constraints, other things.
Yeah, the circular swing set was our 4th iteration before somebody said, yes, let's build that. So don't give up. You just keep trying. And we maybe for every 10 things that we go after, we get 1. And so
that's how it is.
We learned from our son that's the hunting record for a tiger is that they have to launch 10 attacks to get 1 meal. And so we thought, as long as we're as successful as a tiger, we're probably doing okay.
Yeah, you need just that 1 meal to survive. So,
yeah.
Are there other questions from the participants?
Hello.
Yep.
I had a comment. First, I really like your project in the borderline between America and Mexico. It was really interesting. But I had a question because I had a question on how you actually started to focus on play in public spaces, because for me, it's my first time actually seeing someone study play, just the subject of play and social grounds. And it's interesting, and also I'm curious on how much research is going on in that aspect of architecture and public space.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been aware of play just through visiting different places. One time I remember becoming really aware of it was when we were in Berlin, and just the way that kind of the city blocks were, and how there were often playgrounds inside of a kind of a residential block. So thinking about the kind of urban connections and the connections between the playgrounds and housing. And then I think so that kind of, I think, continued. I think it got augmented when we had our own kid, because you end up spending more time at these places, right? But I think it was also, we saw a number of, there's actually been quite a kind of a resurgence in the interest in play. I think, Aldo Nike and maybe the several decades following World War II in Europe, there was a lot of activity going into play, from adventure playgrounds, which are kind of like playgrounds made out of scraps and junk, all the way through to playgrounds that were super creative and very designed. And this kind of interest in play and interest in childhood, interest in design for children was very, very strong, I would say from the 40s through to maybe the 70s. And then it kind of dipped, both in terms of creativity and in terms of basically once insurance companies have had a strong kind of impact on what is deemed safe as a playground, the kind of creativity of the design for play, at least in North America and in Europe, has very much declined. But I think in the mid 2000s, like 2010 until now, there's been quite a number of exhibitions and quite a number of books written about play. There was an exhibition we saw in Madrid. There's been one in Zurich and Munich. That's a traveling one. So a number of people who've through the history of play have kind of brought the topic back up into the discussion, and that's been influential to us, right? To kind of learn about Aldo Nike, but also learn about others, and Noguchi and others practicing both in the United States and Europe, elsewhere. We don't know much about Korean playgrounds, but I know there was like lots of experimentation in Japan, lots of experimentation in lots of places around the world. And so it's interesting to kind of find that information out for ourselves and learn more about it. So it's like it's a really rich kind of history.
And I think also to answer part of your question, Julia's had a lot of opportunities at the university to base classes around researching these things. So it's not, I think Raphael mentioned the idea of like taking play seriously, like it's, we haven't just been able to absorb this by osmosis by seeing a couple of exhibitions, but we have the luxury or the privilege of being in a setting where, we can take a subject and then work with students to like do a deep dive into it, learn more about the history. And so that's been like a privilege and a luxury to be able to take the topic very seriously and over a very long period of time. And you've written a number of papers now about it and presented at conferences. And so I would say it is a very serious research, but I also want to acknowledge that like, because of her appointment at the university, we've had been able to create that space in our practice to be able to take that seriously. Otherwise, like there just wouldn't be time in the day to be able to get into it so seriously. So that's been really nice.
I would say that there's if I didn't know you guys and I just saw the work, there's this underlying social factor to it that is very pertinent to the 21st century conditions of human settlement now, and all of these social polemics that we're facing. And based on something that you mentioned earlier in the lecture, was that you guys see play as a equalizer, right? That there's no restrictions of gender, class, race, economic status, any of that, that it's a equalizing condition, which is very pertinent to what we're facing now, right? In 2020, 2021, all of the problems that, you know, well, around the world. I'm not going to point out any specific.
Well, I mean, I think it's huge here in America where there's so much segregation based on class, based on race. And I think we've just coming, you know, to a new city, we observe this in a very personal way, just how different and separate, depending on who you are, what your city looks like. And we found in very personal experiences just that playgrounds really were some of the only spaces where we could see people from all over coming together, right? Because it was kind of neutral ground. And not just that, but also there was something that we all had in common by being there. And that created the opportunity for conversations. So it's not just kind of being in the same space, but also, you know, being close, even if it's for a moment, to somebody who you have maybe nothing in common with.
Yeah, so if I see it as an outsider, I would say that you guys have a, and again, I'm not putting words in your mouth or speaking for you, but the way that I read it is that perhaps you're trying to make the cities better by focusing on this social aspect, how to make the cities more equitable. And if we focus on play, then perhaps this, again, it seems to be an agenda of the 2021 or 21st century city. You know, how do we make urbanity more equitable, accessible, and you know.
For sure. And I think that's part of the infrastructure in our title, social infrastructure. I think when you know, we all understand that money needs to be spent on bridges and roads because that's infrastructure. And I think what we're trying to argue for is that these things that are, you know, necessary to our social well-being are also should be considered as infrastructure, and they should be invested in and they should be taken care of. And maybe playgrounds are as important or more important than bridges and roads, right? Because they have this social value and this ability to promote a slightly more just society.
Are there any other questions from the participants? I thought Huai wanted to ask something. Having issues with the microphone. You can also type your question if you are having issues with the microphone, or anybody else, if you just want to, you know, write out a question, and then we can also look at it that way.
I think he's frozen.
Yeah.
You're gonna use my.
Oh, there he is.
social distancing.
I have one question that your project is focused on public space, and I wonder that do you care about the community reaction? Is there any survey on their satisfaction or their behavior? Is it similar to your desired goal? Yeah, that's in my question.
Yeah, we've never gone through kind of a formal survey process and kind of tracked reactions in a kind of, you know, formal way or in a scientific way. But like Coryn was saying, we've had a sense of, at least to a small degree, of some kind of user feedback based on social media. And sometimes that can be skewed, right? Like, so if you see your project on Instagram, it's often like because the person wants to take a photo of themselves, so it's not really necessarily to be trusted. But it does, there are other opportunities. We found kind of community Facebook groups where, for example, the Full Circle project gets mentioned quite a lot. And those are much more kind of helpful in terms of, you know, it's not about people promoting themselves or promoting an image of themselves, and it's just much more about kind of like a community message board. And I think that's much more telling to us. On some level, it would be really interesting to do a kind of a survey and all that. It also feels a bit crazy to like ask people to fill out a survey about your work. Like I don't know if I
could imagine doing it about somebody else's work. Like,
yeah, that's right.
it would be
You guys see the integration between social infrastructure and perhaps smart infrastructure. New means of technology being integrated into the play, and that way you can get a sense of new means of play, but also immediate data that you can get feedback on to modify for the next iteration.
Yeah, I think you're talking about projects with much higher budgets than what we've been working on. Yes, one day.
When Google hires us to design something, we'll do that. Yeah, no, but it's interesting, like just talking to the neighbors, for example, we keep coming back to the swing set because it's very close to our house. So it's a place we can go and we can just pick up the trash, and like it's more a part of our lives than all of our other work, which is like a car ride away or somewhere else entirely. But like I've talked to a lot of the neighbors around there, and then they'll tell you what they see and how people use it. And like we learned with the swing set from one of the neighbors that spends a lot of time on her front porch, that every single day she figures it has to be on like her way to work and then her way home from work. There's a woman who she calls Goth Girl that comes to the swing set and like swings so violently for 10 minutes and then just gets off and then just keeps walking to work, and then comes back about 8 hours later and again just shakes the swing set almost apart, and then goes out. And she said it doesn't matter the weather, snowing, raining, she's there every day, day in, day out, 2 times. I don't know, it's just stories like that or I don't think we'd get from a survey, but
and now
it means a lot to us.
And now Goth Girl is your kid's nanny, right?
I would love to. I asked the neighbor to try and take a photo, because I have an image in my head, but I don't know how true it is. But
actually, relating to the book, which you guys do this photo essay or documentation through surveys, is there some type of rigorous documentation of your projects, the ongoing, and the projects that you've done in that way as well, that you can keep track of all the photos and the Instagram and social media, and then you just archive them to see if there's some type of growing up, what would it be now? Growing up post-COVID or growing up
well, I mean, true to the book, we should, rather than doing a survey, we should have conversations, like deep, long conversations with people who've used our things for a while.
For sure with Goth Girl.
For sure with Goth Girl. One day.
I don't know if we have the ego for it, but it's fun to do it about other people's work.
How much more time do you have? I don't want to take, I know your son is watching TV right now, so.
Yeah.
Coryn can answer the rest of your questions. I'm going to put our kid to bed. Good night.
Well, thank you so much, Julia. Perhaps we'll just start wrapping up. If there's any like final question from anybody. Because if not, I'm going to keep on talking.
Well, sorry to keep you from talking, but I have a comment, just another comment to add. Is I think it would be really interesting to see not just people from different racial or gender backgrounds, but also like to see people from different incomes interact in the public space that you created. And in that reason, I think it would be really interesting to do a survey of some sort in your projects sometime, and maybe write a paper about it so that I can read it from here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting, the further you dig down into all sorts of divisions, they often seem to come up with, they're actually at their heart class divisions or economic divisions in many ways. And I think, I mean, Raphael raising the idea of a more equitable city, I think, is at the heart of many, many, many of our problems, or at least, I mean, such a big component of the complexity of all of the issues, certainly facing America right now, but so many places around the world. And if we can play any small part in helping that, that we'll be very grateful. That's the best thing we think we can do with our time and resources and energy.
And to add on to that, ever since COVID happened here, I've noticed that there is a lot more use in public spaces. One space that I really go to, I go to a lot is the Seoul Forest, which is right next to our university. And I've been noticing a lot more people just occupying that space. And now it seems like there are a lot more people occupying that space in many different ways. Like I see some people doing yoga there. I see people doing picnic. I see people just enjoying that space. It's just I see people just watching movies out on the grass, and it's just interesting. But also, it's really interesting to see that place being used by very different people. And I can, you can just tell maybe of like their occupations or their social ranks or their income and just the way they dress or they act in that space. So even though like I haven't seen your project in Seoul or Seoul City, I agree that public spaces can make some kind of a difference in having the same space and then not exactly interacting, but being in the same space actually really helps maybe in our society. So yeah, thank you for your lecture. It was great.
No, you're very welcome, and thank you for listening, especially early in the morning. I wouldn't have been very gung-ho about tuning into a lecture at 9 a.m. So I applaud all of you for making the effort.
No, but it's great because it's about play, so it's fun.
But I will just say that, yeah, I mean, that's why we're always so interested in public spaces, exactly in this moment where we spend so much time in our kind of bubbles, our social media bubbles, our online lives. It's all structured around people who think the same as us. And that often means also earn the same as us and come from the same background as us. And public space always has had that potential for bringing different people together. And I really genuinely feel that it doesn't matter how you interact, but just that even if you just see the other people, you can't help but see how they're similar to you. You know what I mean? Like even if I don't interact with the other guy in the park, but I see him with his kid, I understand that we have that in common. And I think humanizes all of us to each other in a way that we're getting further and further away from in all the other interactions in our lives, which are becoming much more sort of insular and like echo chambers. So I'm a strong believer, as are many people, that like public space is the antidote to those sort of social problems that we're experiencing in contemporary society.
Okay. Well, is there any last question? Perhaps we can just take one more and then we should just wrap up. It's getting late for Coryn and Julia, so.
I have a question.
Yep, Dali.
Sorry. I loved how you shared your project. What happens after? Sorry, I'm nervous. Yeah, I loved how you shared your project. I could see that you think how people react in your project is really important. And I also think that it's a very visual project to see the outcomes of how people react. And there's also, there's always a gap between planning and then constructing and also looking at people's reaction. So I want to know how, what's your main difficulties you encounter when you plan, and the gaps between the constructions, and the gaps between how what you expected people to react and they actually didn't react like what you expected.
That's a fair question. I think the gap you talk about is of course very real, and I think we have the same problem that every designer has, where the people building your design don't always have they don't invest as much love or care or attention to detail as you have in the design of it than they do in the realization of it. And so that's often a struggle to, especially because if you're doing something that's not standard, or they haven't done exactly before, there's sort of an inertia or a reluctance to get buy-in from all the stakeholders, particularly the people making it, but even sometimes the client commissioning it, to like believe in something different and do it, and then do it well. We've been lucky now to find, like, when we find people who we can work with, who do sort of share our sensibility and our vision and believe in what we do, then we try to, of course, work with them again. And so our lives in that way are getting easier. And I imagine that's what every designer probably does, is like set out to find sympathetic partners and then just try to keep working with them. And we're having some success that way. I will quickly say I can't think immediately of a project that was used differently than how we expected, except for that project we showed in El Paso with the balloons. So it's a festival that is dry. So people are not allowed to drink alcohol at the festival. And maybe that should have been my first clue. But the people absolutely tore it apart. It was like almost very violent, except that it was all very happy. but they were very physically, like we went through like twice the number of balloons we expected to. They just kept smashing them, popping them, hitting each other with them, jumping on them, like body slamming them. Like it was very intense and very rough in a way.
You're saying that that's because it was a dry event?
No, I wonder if that was my clue. Probably like
more mellow, or what?
You would think, but like maybe that they had to make it a dry event should have told me something, that, because there probably wasn't a dry event the first time they held it. But at some moment they decided, oh, this needs to be a dry event. Probably should have given me a clue as to, to how people would behave. That was a huge shock, but I do want to like underscore, it was all very good natured. Like it wasn't violent in the sense of antagonism or people angry with each other. Like it was just people enjoying themselves, but in a very, very physical way that I hadn't anticipated. So that was like a big shock to see, but it came at absolutely like the lowest stakes possible. So, that's okay.
Okay. Well, thank you again for your time. It's getting late for you guys, and I want to again recommend. We didn't get you can't see it. There we go. We didn't get much of a chance to talk about the book, but I do recommend everybody finding it. Growing Up Modern: Childhoods and Iconic Homes. I have a lot of questions about the book actually, but unfortunately we don't have time for it in this time. Perhaps in another conversation.
Sure.
Or for another lecture, hopefully.
With pleasure.
And I want to hear if there's more of a growing up postmodern or growing up decon or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you again for your time, both you and Julia, and we really appreciate looking at all of your projects and learning more about what you guys are doing. So thank you again for accepting this invitation, and we hope to see more of the work.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all the students who took time out of your morning to join us. I really appreciate that, and it's been really interesting for me. So thank you very much. And
again, this is recorded and it's gonna be posted on the YouTube channel for everybody to see that had classes in the morning or in different time zones. There's a lot of the European students as well, and student in European market that were also invited to this, but they'll see it after in YouTube. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.